Hello, Mark.
Hi, good morning, Ramesh.
How are you?
I'm very good, very good.
Great.
Beautiful morning here in Washington now that the fog is lifted.
Well, I'm a big fan of fog since we don't get it very often around here.
Right. Well, the fog is not lifted from the Republican presidential contest.
Ooh, that was good. Well done. You're a pro.
Well, some of them woke up this morning to James Dobson's op-ed in the Times announcing that at a special top secret meeting, kind of reminded me of like the Appalachian Conference of all the mafia dons back in the 50s. They decided that they were not going to support, that if there was a Republican candidate was not pro-life, they were not going to support him or her. Whoever that candidate might be, and might support a third party. There's a lot of different ways of reading that, and I'll sort of defer to you, kind of as the expert on that element of the Republican Party. I don't know, how did you read that op-ed this morning?
Well, I think...
reading it literally is one possibility, but let's assume there's a whole bunch of other ways of reading it.
Well, look, at one level, given all the things that social conservatives, particularly pro-lifers, have been saying for years, if Giuliani got the nomination and they just sort of meekly fell in behind him, you'd have to wonder about their self-respect. I mean, look, a lot of pro-lifers, including me, would have to have serious internal debate about whether we could support a Giuliani ticket. But I think my overwhelming reaction to this op-ed and this whole story about Dobson and social conservatives threatening to bolt the party if Giuliani gets the nomination is that it reflects the political immaturity of Christian conservatives. Because, these folks are talking about a contingency plan when they don't even have a plan to deny Giuliani the nomination in the first place. They want to unite around a strategy about what to do if he gets the nomination, when they haven't even united around a candidate in the primaries to prevent him from getting the nomination.
Right, I guess that's right. It's kind of like they're waiving the nuclear option, well over a year before the election. Right.
I mean, look, and it's not as though Giuliani is some sort of unstoppable juggernaut. He's been stuck around 30 in the polls. He's declined from early March. He's got vulnerabilities that have not really been explored in paid advertising campaigns.
Yep.
You've got a majority of the electorate that does not say, a majority of the Republican primary electorate is not apparently aware that he is pro-choice, let alone everything else in his record, that he has been for public funding in the past, that he is still for public funding as long as it's done at the state level, let alone you add in the positions on guns and on immigration, his opposition to welfare reform. It just seems to me that there are a lot of things that people who are opposed to Giuliani's nomination could be doing.
His opposition to welfare reform is news to me.
In 1996, he said that the federal welfare reform legislation had some good elements and some bad elements, but the bad elements, in his view, outweighed the good. I think he was mainly thinking about the provisions related to immigrants.
Immigrants, yeah.
And of course, he went to federal court to try to stop that. But look, at the end of the day, that he took a position to the left of Hillary Clinton on welfare reform.
Right. Although he did hire the guy from Wisconsin and actually ran one of the harshest.
Yeah, Jason Turner. He was look. I mean, in his
harsh. I mean, I'll be less judgmental. I mean, he ran one of the most rigorous workfare programs in the country.
That's right. I mean, he's got a welfare reform. I mean, he's got his own welfare reform, and in a way, that's more important than where he stood on legislation he wasn't voting on or signing. But at the same time, it is the sort of thing that is not going to go over well in a Republican primary, any more than his endorsement of Cuomo or his opposition to NAFTA.
Right, that's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, he's got a lot of baggage, and there's the negative ads sort of right themselves.
Opposition to NAFTA? He was also an opponent of NAFTA?
He was an opponent of NAFTA, that's right.
That's interesting. I thought I knew a lot of stuff about Rudy Giuliani. That's Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you, and obviously, if you're concerned about Giuliani, there are a million ways to join forces to stop him. The paradox seems to be that the Republicans, well, I mean, there are a couple of things about it. I mean, one, Giuliani does have an undeniable appeal on certain levels to other parts of the character of people who are social conservatives as well.
Right.
And
I mean, this is the
maybe the sense of his sort of authoritarian personality is appealing.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily put it that way. I do think that, you get the sense with McCain and even with Mitt Romney that they care a lot about, say, what the New York Times editorial page is saying about them.
Right.
And you certainly don't have that impression from Giuliani. He's willing to pick fights with liberals that conservatives tend to think need picking. The latest the ad war with the New York Times over Petraeus, or I suppose with MoveOn.org over Petraeus was one instance of that. Look, there are a lot of things that conservatives do like about Giuliani. They like the aura of executive competence in contrast to the current administration.
Right. I'll tell you. I mean, I think one thing you can see it with the ad about the ad about Move On and with a bunch of other things. You could see that at the most visceral level, Giuliani hates Hillary Clinton more than anybody else in the field, and he's dying to run against Hillary Clinton. I mean, I think one reason that a candidate other than Clinton might be a better opponent if Giuliani were the nominee is that Giuliani wouldn't quite have the passion for destroying that individual, and he's clearly what he's doing now is he's moving the fight to Hillary Clinton, which is a pretty slick way of kind of feeding the base.
Yeah, no, I'm sort of amazed that more of the Republican candidates aren't doing that.
Right. Yeah. Well, they might actually just have the effect of destroying her before the nomination. But we'll come back to that. I mean, the other paradox then is there are two things about obviously there's also a lot of jockeying for position within the evangelical world, right? And Dobson is somewhat, I think, on the way out. Even though liberals only just discovered him like 2 years ago, they think that this suddenly emerged on the scene. But in a sense, Dobson's becoming, is kind of the old guard that's still grasping for relevance here. And there's clearly another wave of evangelicals for whom there's actually an array of issues of which pro-life is only one of them. Is that a correct analysis? And that the op-ed is a little bit of a grasp for saying, I, James Dobson, remain the voice of American social conservatism.
There may be something like that developing among younger evangelicals. We've certainly heard a lot of talk about it. I suspect it's a little bit further off than people think, and I don't think that Dobson's really responding to it that much. I mean, one thing that people forget about Dobson, particularly people who, as you say, have only recently been clued into his influence, is that he is not primarily a political figure. I mean, his influence among Christian conservatives is really from his child-rearing advice. And he's, I mean, to a certain extent, there's a kind of dilettantism when he gets involved in politics, which is why, you see, I think, some sort of foolish moves that he makes, this op-ed being one of them. I mean, the other thing, of course, is just that...
Well, why is the op-ed a foolish move? Just...
Well, because
for the reasons we talked about before. Because
yeah, exactly. I mean, I just think it's...
Before, yeah.
And it's... I remember... It reminds me of the 1997 gubernatorial re-election campaign of Christy Todd Whitman, when all of these socially conservative organizations and leaders were going around demanding that Republican office holders not go campaign for Whitman. You had conservatives complaining about Rick Santorum and Dan Quayle and Jim Nicholson, who was at the time the head of the Republican National Committee, And it was just sort of insane because, I mean, look, of course the head of the RNC is going to go campaign for a Republican governor facing re-election. I mean, it's like expecting somebody to hold a press conference every morning denouncing his wife.
Right.
And and it just seemed like
there's also very little evangelical right in the state of New Jersey.
Yeah, that's right.
Bill Bradley. When we would get calls on an issue that was a social issue, the receptionist would kind of always ask, "Where are you calling from?" And it was always from Pennsylvania,
right?
Because they knew they had to call across the border because nobody in New Jersey would call.
There was at that time I spoke to a pretty savvy social conservative activist. He said, this is one of those things you do but you don't say. We should have just done what we could to take her out. And then the day after the election, we should have gotten up there and said in front of the cameras, we're very sorry that Governor Whitman, unfortunately, was unable to connect with the socially conservative voters of New Jersey.
Right.
And
all 10 of them.
And this is what they should be taking Rudy out, and then saying, well, it's too bad that he was so out of step with the base on
but to do
abortion.
that, they need a candidate. So they need a candidate.
They need a candidate, but that's the other problem, that it is very hard. Look, speaking personally, I don't know which of these guys to support. I'm pretty much in the anybody but Giuliani camp myself, but I do worry.
So am I.
Yeah, it's just convergence.
Right.
Possibly for slightly different reasons, but look, if I do worry that people who support Romney may end up giving him the nomination because it might turn out that Thompson was the strongest challenger to him in the primary, or vice versa. And it's just very hard to determine that.
Right. Well, there are a couple of things that strike. I keep being struck by the fact that Romney is nowhere. The latest poll has him at 10%. I don't think he's hit 10% before. McCain's at 15%. Romney registers not at all in national polls. Now, I know his name recognition is relatively low. It's obviously lower than Obama, but it should be, if there was any base of support there for Romney, you should be cracking 10%, or you should be in the generic Republican primary polls, which are polling Republican likely voters typically across the country, or trying to poll likely voters, as hard as that is to do, and it's lower in the South. I've noticed when they do the state polls, which again are always shaky. There seems to be a lead in Iowa. There's a soft lead in New Hampshire, but I just sort of don't now.
There are conflicting polls out of South Carolina, some of which have had him jumping in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah. But there are a couple of explanations for that. My sort of instinctive explanation is, why should anybody support Romney? He has less experience than anyone in the field on either party, probably ever.
Less experience than
in
Obama?
Any kind of public service. What's that?
Less experience than Obama?
Sure, tons less of experience. He's a one-term governor who basically, achieved one thing while he was governor. Obama was a state legislator for 8 years, which I think is actually terrific qualification. I think we've had too few presidents or presidential candidates with that experience in the kind of real give and take of a state legislator, where people are actually kind of engaged. They're not always off at the press conference or the fundraiser or whatever that they do in Congress. I think he's got the 4 years in the as governor of Massachusetts, and you can count the Utah Olympics if you want as a kind of public service. The rest is basically making money, which is a fun thing to do. I don't think it qualifies you in any way for public service. Now, Republicans might feel differently about that, how they view that.
I was thinking mostly in terms of executive experience, in which case he'd outshine Obama. On the other hand,
only if you count the Utah Olympics, because the rest is just your private equity capital. You're not an executive.
But even being governor for 4 years.
Yeah. Okay.
So. But anyway. We were talking about Romney and why he's had so hard a time breaking out in the national polls. And there was at least one report a couple weeks ago that he had started doing some national advertising on Fox and pulled it when it wasn't moving his numbers at all. I'm not sure. I don't know. I haven't seen any confirmation of that report. But that would be, I mean, if that were true, then the Romney people would have serious reasons for worrying. And of course, obviously they have reasons for worrying, but they will not obviously win the nomination if their national numbers don't go up. I mean, they're obviously hoping that a state-by-state primary strategy will catapult them, and that eventually, look, the good press coming out of a win in Iowa will give him more momentum in the national polls and so on.
Right, but he's not a natural Iowa. I mean, I think his lead in Iowa is a kind of bought lead. It's because he's the only one on the air. I mean, he's not the only one on the air, but he's dominating the airwaves there. He's doing all the things you do with money in Iowa, and I'm not sure that at the end, when in my experience, it's typically around the first of the year when it starts to sort of Iowa just breaks decisively in one direction or the other. I'm sure it'll be earlier now. I could easily see that just fading because Iowa Republicans, who are slightly more isolationist than the National Republican Party. I don't really.
Well, Iowa Republicans are also more socially conservative than the National Party, and I think so
they won't break for Giuliani.
Well, and I think the judge who issued a pro same-sex marriage ruling in Iowa gave Romney a gift because he is the only major candidate of the top four in the Republican side who's for a marriage amendment. And I would not be surprised to see him exploit that issue between now and then.
Uh-huh. And you think there's still enough energy around that?
And in the Republican primary electorate in Iowa, yes, I would think so. Especially, again, maybe not so much in the absence of this court ruling, but a court ruling in the state. Yeah, I think that's going to help Romney considerably.
Right. And there's a Bob Novak column this morning about his Mormonism.
And a Newsweek story on the Mormonism this week too.
Yeah.
And I think Novak, it's sort of, Novak. There's two interesting things about this. One is that Novak reports on an emerging consensus, I guess, in the Romney campaign that Romney needs to make speech sometime on how unfair it is to impose some sort of religious test for office. And that just left me sort of scratching my head because I just don't see who that's supposed to sway. I mean, if there are people who are opposed to him because he's a Mormon, does he really think that lecturing them on how bigoted they are is going to change their minds?
Right.
I just
kind
don't
of like
see
George Bush's tactic on immigration that really worked.
Yeah. And then the other thing, which I think is right, that Novak says at one point, is there a chance that that the Republican Party could get saddled with a nominee who cannot get elected because of his religion? And I think that places a spotlight on a slightly different issue than everybody's been talking about, because everybody has thought about the the politics of sort of anti-Mormonism as being a specifically evangelical and Southern evangelical thing. And if you look at the survey data, actually, like the Pew data on this, it suggests that, yes, among evangelicals, Mormonism is a net negative by about 24 points. That's just about the same as the net negative among Democratic voters. That there is antipathy to Mormonism that is not confined to the conservative evangelical segment of the Republican primary electorate. And this is not only a primary problem, but a general election problem as well. And that's one of the things that strikes me about Romney is that, when you look at somebody like Giuliani or somebody like McCain, they've got primary problems that are not general election problems. Right. Romney's primary problems are Mormonism and flip-flops, and they're both problems that would, if he won the nomination, would continue to plague him in the fall.
Right. That's a really good way to put it, especially as he's going to try to flip back again as soon as he gets the nomination.
Which I don't think anyone would put past him.
Right. I mean, I think it's like flip-flop. Every politician's guilty of flip-flopping on something, and it's part of, it's not. It's in a sense, it's part of your job in a democracy. The degree to which Romney is a transparent phony kind of takes it to another level that I think has something to do with his with the flatness of his reception. I think that's interesting. Although I also think obviously there's a lot of people in the country who don't, I mean, don't really associate much of anything with Mormonism, and their anti-Mormonism may be a very, when confronted with an individual, if you're comfortable with that individual, you're not going to. The Mormonism is not an issue. I mean, actually, I was with a friend of mine from Oregon yesterday who said that he thought that Gordon Smith was more likely to be a Mormon, more likely to be the first Mormon on a national ticket than Romney was, and I'd forgotten that Gordon Smith's a Mormon. I mean, Mormons do get elected in, obviously.
Now people forget about Harry Reid being a Mormon.
Yeah. I mean, although that's probably the third heaviest Mormon state, right?
Yeah.
Nevada.
Well, but think about it. Look, if let's say Romney's the nominee in September and October, national news magazines, 60 Minutes, they just do sort of flat, neutral accounts, sort of inside the Mormon Church. I do not think. I think it is sufficiently unlike other religions that are unlike other religions in this country that go by the name Christian that it will seem weird to a lot of people. Mm-hmm. I mean, look, I'm a Catholic. I eat my God every week. I mean, a religion that is seen from the outside from an unsympathetic perspective can often look extremely weird. I just think for cultural and historical reasons, Mormonism is going to look weirder to a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And I think if you're sort of, if your main concern is Republicans winning the general election in November, you've got to be worried about some sort of X factor where you're not going to really know how much damage it does until after the election's over. Right.
That may be, although I do think that, I think that for somebody like Romney to convey that, in fact, to be talking about his religion when you're such an empty suit, actually, to be talking about religion of any kind is of value. I mean, one of my theories about religion and politics is that speaking in a very broad generality, people are. It's why conservative Christians are very comfortable with Joe Lieberman, for example. People are more comfortable when they feel like people's values are rooted in something.
There's something non-negotiable.
The thing about John Kerry is he comes across to people as sort of secular. You feel like his values are rooted in a kind of technocratic, liberal, democratic, here's what we think is, technocratic liberalism, here's what we think is best for people, rather than actually coming out of some value system. And as long as you feel like somebody's ideas and approach to life comes out of a value system, you can be comfortable with whatever. It doesn't have to be your own.
No, that's interesting because your description of Kerry's sort of radiating a kind of secularism, even though he is in fact a Catholic.
He's an observant Catholic, but I never believed it for a second.
A Catholic anyway. It reminds me of Dukakis in that respect. I think that was one of his flaws as a candidate, whereas you couldn't say that about Clinton or Gore, and Clinton and Gore did reasonably well in their presidential races. Right. Now, the interesting question will be, whether Hillary Clinton's religiosity will have that. Will place her more in the sort of Clinton and Gore camps, which I suspect it will. Right.
Well, it may also be that how Southern accent conveys religiosity no matter what. Obama conveys religiosity in various ways. Clinton to me whereas a Massachusetts accent, it's just a little harder to do it. Or there's something about tone and how you approach politics. To me, Clinton is deeply rooted in a kind of Midwestern Protestantism that I sort of have no doubt, and it doesn't. I do see her. They feel her approach does seem kind of grounded to me in a value system.
Yeah, if anything, there is occasionally, although you see less of it now than you used to, a sort of hectoring moralism that comes out of that. So we, can we just a couple words about Fred Thompson, because this seems to be the week where kind of all the press stories are basically, oh my God, Thompson's falling flat, and I think that Adam Nagorny had a story about how he had to sort of demand applause from a crowd.
And actually, when I was looking for that Novak column, I went to townhall.com to find the Novak column and was reading a column by a guy named Steve Chapman, who I don't even know who he is.
Chicago Tribune, libertarian writer.
Chicago Tribune, about how about how just completely indifferent Thompson is to and how ridiculous it is that he just kind of got bored in the Senate after a little while and wandered away, which is always my perception of him too. And it seems to be that's another campaign that's it's almost like the Wes Clark campaign in 2004. Like, its best day was the day before he announced.
Yeah, and on paper it looked really like a great primary candidate, idea for a primary candidacy. I think we've had about 3-4 weeks of pretty bad press for Thompson. He is, however, doing reasonably well in the polls. I mean, people talk about hitting a plateau, but Doug Schoen pointed out, that the Democratic pollster pointed out the other day, that if you average out the last 4 Gallup polls and just look at people who are extremely likely to vote in a Republican primary, Thompson actually has a 7-point lead over Giuliani.
Yeah. No, he does look fine in the polls, but boy, is there no energy there.
People complain about it. I mean, there is a certain value to wowing sort of political insiders and even lowly journalists and opinion journalists. Partly because there's leading indicators of some of these things, although certainly fallible leading indicators. He's certainly not winning that primary.
Right.
I think one interesting thing, though, that I'm hearing sort of behind the scenes is that Thompson seems to think more than the other guys that he needs to issue detailed policy proposals. You hear about his policy people sort of, burning midnight oil working on stuff, that he's going to have some sort of detailed tax proposal and healthcare proposal and so forth, more than we've seen from the others. If so, it'll be interesting to see if that actually gets him anything. But also it just seems that, as with everything related to the Thompson campaign, time's a wasting.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, this is one of my favorite topics because I wrote a New York Times op-ed that basically said, Democrats should have fewer policy plans, and more of a kind of, statement of principles. I would have been happy to see Hillary Clinton, for example, say, look, I'm going to try to do something that's going to look a lot like the Edwards plan, a lot like the Obama plan. We're all basically in the same place. Here's the basic principles. I'm not going to give you all the working pieces. Be very happy with that. Republicans have generally gone way too far in the other direction. I mean, there's almost nothing. It would really mark him as a candidate to have detailed policy plans. Huckabee has a little bit. Tommy Thompson, if he's still even in the race,
I think he dropped out. Yeah,
he did. Okay, well, we're sorry to see him go because he actually had a little bit of a health policy plan, but it would really be distinctive in a way and interesting to see. But again, you get in a race late, there's a million things you need to do to have your sort of best and brightest off talking to a bunch of health economists and trying to figure out something that you're actually probably going to botch anyway and create a big target. That probably isn't the best use of your time.
I'm sort of amazed at how little in the way of detail conservatives have been demanding of the Republican candidates on taxes. I mean, it's enough for them just to say, they want to make the Bush tax cuts permanent, and they want some sort of unspecified tax reform, and that's been apparently fine for most conservatives. I actually am sort of gratified by this because I think most of the tax reform proposals that Republicans would be likely to latch onto would be disasters, politically, and not all that great in terms of policy either.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that because I agree. But I think it's a symptom of the pledge, the Grover Norquist approach of getting everyone to sign the pledge, has kind of. I'm not sure who on the Republican field has signed or not. I know McCain has not.
Giuliani hasn't either.
And Giuliani hasn't either. Has Romney?
Romney has, yes.
Romney has. I mean, to have two of your leading candidates refusing to sign the pledge, you have more and more people not signing the pledge, I think. And beginning to seem like sort of an irresponsible thing to do, and there's no thing to replace it. The pledge was a substitute for tax policy for a decade.
Yeah, well, I mean, the the anti-tax hike consensus among Republicans is still pretty strong.
Yeah.
It's still very strong. I mean, it remains the case that no Republican has voted for a broad-based tax increase since 1990. I mean, in Congress, which is really saying something.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, leaving aside things like cigarette tax increases and getting rid of an oil depletion allowance or whatever, but no income tax hikes, no cap gains, no dividend tax hikes. So, I mean, in a way, the pledge may have sort of outlived its usefulness in that, it was necessary at a time when the Republicans hadn't been so thoroughly branded as an anti-tax increase party, but now it really has.
Right, but the problem is you can't expect all Republicans to go down to the wire on extending all the Bush tax cuts.
Well, you might have been able to had you had a different configuration of power in Washington. Yeah,
right.
But you certainly without with the Democratic Congress, it's going to be
right. Well, and also if you hadn't run up entitlement spending and you hadn't had the war spending and so forth, you might have a different fiscal picture.
Yeah.
You might be able to do it then, but in the current fiscal picture, it's just hard to imagine these guys continuing to essentially defer the costs of the things that they actually want to spend money on.
Yeah, if you don't mind my retreading the ground I covered in a New York Times op-ed a week or two ago, it does strike me that, look, you can make the argument that Republican tax cuts from Reagan through George W. Bush were too heavily tilted towards the rich, but they gave something to large numbers of people in the middle of the economic spectrum. Bush's tax cut did give an expanded child tax credit. Reagan's tax cut income tax across the board at a time when the distribution of income tax payments went a lot lower on the spectrum than it does now. Whereas these guys, nobody's talking about anything that would benefit the middle class, really. Romney has a little tiny tax cut for middle class savers, but for the most part, their focus is on the dividends, the capital gains, and the tax rate for high earners. Which, leaving aside everything else that Republicans have going against them in 2008, if this strategy works, it will be the first time it's ever worked.
Right. I think that's a really good way to put it. I always felt that one of the great victories, one of the things that Bush did well against Gore in 2000 was, really establish the distinction between, if you read the transcripts of the debates, Gore had all kinds of tax cuts, kind of like Obama's tax cut plan, all kinds of little good things that could get you a tax credit or whatever. And Bush kept coming back and saying, you've got all these things where you're trying to use the tax code to encourage this or discourage that. My principle is everybody's taxes will be low. That's my principle, period. But to me, that really exemplifies, the two different approaches to politics. And the Republicans seem to be I don't think that's. I'm not sure you can make that promise right now.
Yeah, it would be very hard.
Everybody's taxes will be lower, or nobody's taxes will go up. I'm not sure you could make such a sort of universalist promise right now. But it sure is a hell of a lot more appealing than just capital gains, dividends, create economic growth, and maybe you'll get than a pure trickle-down argument.
Right, well, particularly at a time when economic growth seems to be doing fine without necessarily leading to the kind of outcomes that people want.
Right, yeah, exactly. And there's no shortage of capital that requires a capital gains, a special capital gains rate. I'm frustrated because I'd like to see the Democrats be a little more aggressive on a kind of real tax reform agenda of their own that would be based on the principle of, two people make $50,000, they should pay the same taxes whether their income comes from work or from the income from investments. And I think Edwards is sort of there, but it's definitely a lower note in his agenda than it was 4 years ago, and Obama chose a different path, and I don't see Hillary Clinton taking that path. But there's never
Let's talk a little bit about the Democrats, if you will. This has been the week or the month of Hillary is inevitable in the press, And since I've always sort of thought Hillary is inevitable, it's kind of difficult for me to say that this is overstated, although I do think it is a little overstated. You know, I mean, it's just it does seem as though people are not paying enough attention to the fact that the ad wars haven't really begun on either side, and that can change things quite a bit.
Right. And that the Iowa field organizing wars haven't begun. You know, Iowa, you basically put a lot of people on the ground, and you know, it really is face-to-face politics, not entirely involving the candidate, involving a lot of organizational strength, which all three candidates have in Iowa.
Yeah, I mean, but look, if there are things going on there on the ground, you know, that aren't getting covered so much, it could be that a lot of the second guessing we're seeing about Obama will end up being sort of pointless. You know, we could. I mean, it's not inconceivable that Obama could do a lot better in Iowa than people are looking at now.
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, it is not time to say it's inevitable, but there is something, and I say this, I speak as somebody who's, you know, generally a little more sympathetic to Obama and Edwards than to Clinton, a little more enthusiastic about Obama in particular being the nominee, but kind of fine with any of them, or Chris Dodd.
What accounts for that greater enthusiasm?
For Obama, well, it's a couple things. One is that I generally, I'm kind of ready to move on to a different kind of politics than revisiting the approach of the 90s. I mean, I think Obama's language, which isn't about, it's not about, you know, traditional bipartisanship and we'll find some liberal Republican to support our bill. It's about kind of trying to actually reconfigure coalitions in a way that actually finds some alliances with actual conservatism is fascinating.
So it's the audacity of hope for you.
It's audacity of hope stuff, and you know, and a general belief that he'll be able to do some things and create a sense of, you know, this country's really changing in a significant way that will be important in foreign policy as well. That I'm somewhat more enthusiastic about, and I just think that will be an interesting thing to see. And I'm also convinced. I mean, I think what we'll be talking about in 2 weeks, and what Democrats will be talking about in about 2 weeks, and this may have an effect on the race or it may not, is the panic of Democratic candidates in states and districts that Senator Clinton does not need to win the election. So, for example, I'll give you a typical example. Democrats probably have a shot to defeat Mitch McConnell in Kentucky. You know, hugely unpopular. Because he's the minority leader, he has no ability to separate himself from the president. You know, the Republican Party in Kentucky is collapsing under scandal, all kinds of things. It's a possibility. Hillary Clinton's at the top of the ticket. It's no possibility. Period.
But you think it's a possibility if Obama's at the top of the ticket?
You know, that's a little bit more of a throw of the dice, right? I do think that there are some things. I mean, I think if you look at each of the, you look at states that are possibilities for the Senate. Colorado, for example, where Clinton did quite poorly in a recent poll. North Carolina, where Elizabeth Dole is you know, horrible. I mean, there are a number of Republican senators who are below 50%. Elizabeth Dole is one of them. And again, you know, Obama could generate some black turnout in North Carolina that would be a boost to a Democratic candidate, as opposed to a drag. By my count, there are about 6 Senate seats that are kind of on the cusp. That would probably be in worse shape for Democrats if Hillary Clinton were at the top of the ticket, and there are any number of House seats. For me, it's kind of like, okay, if I want to see significant change, if I want to see health care, if I want to see universal health care, some other changes in the next.
You need more senators.
That's all you need. I mean, it's not a matter of the character or the plan that they put out this year or their political will or any of that stuff. It's, do you have 56 Democratic senators? Because if you have 56 Democratic senators, you can get to 60.
Yeah, I mean, if I were...
If you have 52, 53, it's 93 all over again. Mitch McConnell holds the line on everything. Nothing happens. And
the midterms could conceivably be quite a disaster.
And the midterms could be a disaster because people look up and say, what the hell happened? We thought we were getting change in this country, and it's just two parties yelling at each other. We'll try the other one again.
Yeah, and memories of Bush will have, and the things that people disliked about Bush will have receded.
Right. I don't, that'll be an interesting question. I mean, I think I've always had this thing about Bush as that I would like to see Democrats be able to use Bush for as long as Republicans used Jimmy Carter. There was some great moment in '88 or whatever when Dan Quayle gave a speech, and all he did was just say Jimmy Carter, Jimmy Carter, Jimmy Carter, Democrats over and over again. It's like,
or the way Herbert Hoover's corpse was dragged around American politics for decades.
Right. I think you can wave that bloody shirt for a little while.
Well, we'll see about that. I mean, look, one of the things that you find, you find Republican strategists who are saying things about, the separation that Republicans need to make from Bush. And so obviously that's true. I mean, that would be true even if Bush were in fact popular, just because of the, generic time for a change sentiment at the end of 8 years. But at the end of the day, I just think it's inconceivable that Republicans could win the presidential election in November of 2008 with Bush stuck at 30%. I mean, it's just, I can see them winning it with Bush at 40. I'm not saying Bush has to be at 50 or something, but it just seems absurd to me that this idea that you can achieve a separation that strong from a president.
Right. And I'm not sure what's going to move Bush's numbers at this point. Now, that's, it's interesting because from a Republican point of view, I think it probably would actually be healthier. Democrats had a problem for a long time. Where they couldn't win the presidency, and this is particularly in the before '94. And the reason that, and this is part of the diagnosis of what went wrong, I think, for the Democratic Party, was that they couldn't win the presidency. Okay, they won the presidency with Clinton, but there was a complacency of, well, we always control the Congress. We always have enough power that we control the Congress. Even if we don't always control the Senate, we control the House. We have institutional power. And so there was never the actual, the examination of what the Democratic Party stood for and how it should approach things always kind of got cut short. And I think it would probably be extremely healthy for the Republican Party to kind of be stripped of everything. So that there's no illusion of we're going to gain power by filibustering in the Senate. That's not how we're going to do it. We really actually have to confront what does it take to be a party that can build a majority and not be a regional party and so forth. That probably actually be better for the long-term prospects of the Republican Party and for that task of separating from Bush.
Yeah, in terms of Republican revival, it just strikes me that in 2000. Republicans needed to make some substantial change. And it was possible for the party to make substantial change, not all of which were necessary, some of which were, because you had this anointed, huge, strong frontrunner around whom the entire party establishment had coalesced. And so, you had both the consensus among Republican strategists about what needed to be done and the ability to actually force that change on the party. Whereas right now, in this divided field, it actually impedes that process because everybody just wants to cater to this base. Fred Thompson, apparently his new campaign tactic is going to be to ask people where his rivals were in 1994. So that's that's the basis for a future Republican majority.
Where they were in '94 on what?
Oh, just that Thompson was part of the Republican Revolution, and Mitt Romney was distancing himself from Reagan, and Rudy Giuliani was, distancing himself from the National Republican Party. That's,
I see, right.
that sort of thing, and and it just strikes me as the base right now is in charge. And look, I'm a conservative base voter myself, but some changes need to be made, and this primary process is ideally designed to thwart that process.
Right. I guess so, and I guess that charge goes particularly against Romney, who at the same time as the Republican Revolution was reviving conservatism, was running that the race against Ted Kennedy.
Right, that's right.
Right, yeah.
And saying that it wouldn't be fair to call him a Reagan Republican.
Right. Just to go back to Hillary Clinton for a second, I mean, I kind of gave my case for why I was generally more supportive of Obama. But, I think I'm like a lot of Democrats who are just kind of watching what Hillary Clinton's able to do with awe. I mean, the whole rollout of her health plan and the way she handled. I mean, to me, it's just amazing. It's just consummate professionalism, and you got to respect that. There's a sort of admiration that one has for that. That she understands the situation in terms of the problems she has. I mean, this is somebody who came into New York, a state she was not from. Understood that, knowing that, 48% of the people will say they're never going to vote for her under any circumstances, and she wins with 53% of the vote. And that's, she knows exactly the problems. It's this methodical approach to politics. You understand the problems you face, you set out to solve them, and you don't make unnecessary mistakes. There's a little bit that it's not inspiring enough in certain ways, but there's a price for inspiring as well. And
if I were a liberal, at least a liberal whose main concern was domestic policy, I would not pay any attention to the substantive differences among the Democratic candidates. I would not really pay much attention to the differences on these sort of ethereal qualities of leadership. I would just try to figure out who had the best chance of winning the biggest and pulling in as many senators, because the differences just seem to me so slight, and the possibilities for liberals of achieving a pretty big win in 2008 and getting a lot of that domestic agenda through seems to me to be pretty good.
Right. Well, I think if you put it that way, and just to who's going to bring in the most Democratic senators, I do think that's a strike against Hillary Clinton. But if you also say, you don't want to gamble, somebody put it this way to me a few months ago, that with Obama, you have somebody who could be an amazing president and could be a complete flop for all you know. Whereas with Hillary Clinton, you kind of know what you're going to get. I think, obviously Hillary Clinton's botched some things in her life, done some things well, but I think that there's something a little bit to that. There's a basic competence, both as a primary candidate, as a general election candidate, and as president, that you kind of can expect with Hillary Clinton.
So you have at least you have a slight worry that you'd be an Obama as Carter, that would be you'd have a failed presidency that would continue to be a drag for years.
Carter or early Clinton. I mean, you've never set foot in the White House before. I mean, it's funny how much credit how much experience we credit Hillary Clinton with, that you wouldn't credit Laura Bush with that experience. I mean, in a way, she's not significant. She doesn't have significantly more political experience than Obama, unless you count being the spouse of the president. But in reality, she absolutely, unquestionably does.
And everybody does, in fact, as you say.
And there's no doubt in my mind that she has understood exactly. I feel like in the Senate, she's understood how to operate in the Senate, and she certainly understands exactly what they didn't understand in healthcare in 1993. And okay, that's there's no experience like doing something wrong and then understanding exactly why you did it wrong and what you would need to do differently. I mean, that's the perfect kind of experience. Doing something well, you don't necessarily learn something from.
How are we doing on time? Do we have a little time to talk about healthcare?
Yeah, we have a little time to talk about healthcare. We're at about 49 minutes.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Of course, the big thing this week is the veto fight over the expansion of SCHIP, the state children's health insurance program, where it looks as though Bush has the votes in the House to sustain his veto. And a lot of people think, with either glee or despair, depending on where they're coming from, that this is a big political problem for Republicans who've been against this.
Yeah. Well, give me the case for the veto.
The policy case or the political?
The political.
I think that if you were just going to look at it in terms of Republican fortunes, you wouldn't have done this veto. But it's one of these cases where I think it is a survivable fight. And look, I mean, if you think of S-chip as one step along a way towards a destination on healthcare policy that you don't want the country to go to, that you really don't want the country to go to, as a lot of us conservatives do, and this is one of the reasons you get involved in politics. So, I mean, it's sort of the normal political calculation that you just let this one slide for political reasons. I think wouldn't apply. The reason I think that this is a survivable fight. You look at these polls, like Washington Post, ABC this week had one where they asked people, do you want S-chip, do you want federal aid for children's health insurance expanded by $35 billion? And it was something like a 70-25 split. It seems to me that your sort of red state Republicans can easily go back to their districts and say, look, I'm for children's health care. I'm not for this bill. This bill is a transfer of money from red states to blue states. And I think they're fine. I mean, I think they're actually right about that. But leaving that aside, I think they can get away with it. And they're fine. Now, the more... And everybody who's not fine, who couldn't get away with that, has gone south on the issue. They've all flipped. They've all voted for it. Right. So I think they're fine, too. So the only problem you have left is with the presidential candidates. And for them, I think, as long as you just broaden the healthcare discussion, and I think they're okay, too. I do think that I think that the prevailing model of the politics of healthcare assumes that everybody's worried about the uninsured. And I think that actually people are more worried about the security of their own health care. And if Republicans have a health care plan that puts a little bit of a dent in the number of the uninsured and also includes various ways to make insurance more portable for people, I don't think that this is the killer issue for Democrats that a lot of liberals do.
Right. So in other words, the Republican plan is spend more money on people who already have health insurance and block S-chip.
Well, not necessarily spend more money on it. I mean, look. I mean, if you did things like allowing people buy health insurance out of state so that they could get more affordable health insurance. Look, I understand the arguments that liberals make against that as a policy. Obviously, while disagreeing with it, but I think that just telling people you're going to make insurance more affordable that way, and that this will both help people who have insurance and people who don't have health insurance currently. I think that's not. It is not an unwinnable argument for Republicans.
Okay, but I mean, nobody was sitting around 2 years ago and saying, "Oh, this S-chip, which has been around for 8 years now, is this slippery slope towards national health care." Right? It wasn't bothering anybody. It was very, very popular. It's a product of that brief period of kind of Gingrich-Clinton consensus on getting things done, passed around the same time as the balanced budget agreement.
It was part of the balanced budget agreement, if I remember.
Yeah, I mean it's a really sweet example of actually people getting things done, and it's not a slippery slope to anything because it hasn't it's been what it's only rolled backwards, which is why it needs to be revisited. But it wasn't. I mean, there was no anti-S-chip constituency out there. It wasn't like welfare reform where there were clearly there were things going on that made people angrier and angrier.
And look, I mean, although I opposed the creation of S-chip back in the day, I wouldn't get rid of it now. But I also wouldn't remove the cap on it, and I wouldn't expand it this heavily, especially up to higher levels of income eligibility.
Right. Well, and obviously, I mean, the fight is creating something that is actually either way it turns out. I mean, if the veto were overridden, particularly, but even if not, I mean, it is sort of a marker now of moving forward with significant majorities in both houses on coverage. And I mean, the things have happened, like Senator Grassley being so angry about Bush over the veto that he joined as a co-sponsor of Senator Wyden's universal health care bill. I look at that and I think that's great. I mean, in a sense, now you're actually creating this confrontation on ground that you do not want to have. You would not want to have a fight. Bush is actually helping to create the slippery slope towards.
Well, look, I mean, you would have had that. You would have had a fight over this in in 08 and 09 anyway.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, it's just a question of, I mean, do you engage this larger battle now or later? It's not obvious to me that the terrain is going to get all that much better if you just wait. So.
Right.
I mean, one thing I think that is absolutely politically necessary is for Republicans at some point to come up. But let me put it this way: I do not think that this is the last chapter of this legislatively. I would not even say that the Democrats have no chance of getting this enacted into law over the next year and a half. I can see ways that they could maybe get this into law this fall, in fact. And as this debate continues, Republicans do need to unite around some kind of alternative proposal. And they've had a very difficult time coming up with such an alternative proposal. I think largely due to Senator Coburn's stubbornness and Grover Norquist's stubbornness.
Right. Well, I mean, and then this may be one of those things that forces the kind of Republican confrontation with itself and how it resolves these differences.
Yeah, but
in a legislative sense, rather than all being projected onto the presidential campaign, where it's actually quite hard to resolve.
Yeah, but actually, I mean, that's another thing. One of the things that's been a problem for the Republicans is, Tom Coburn wanted to offer tax credits to the uninsured to increase the number of, to take the Bush idea of tax reform on health care and make it more progressive by replacing the tax deduction with a tax credit. And and people like Grover Norquist were saying, well, you can't do that because if you get rid of a tax deduction and replace it with a refundable tax credit, that's, according to our definition, a tax increase.
Spending, yeah.
Well, leaving aside, the merits of that issue, a Republican presidential candidate doesn't have that problem because they're not tied to a particular bill. They can just say, they can have another tax cut that they're offering on the side and use that to net it out. So they don't have the problem with, say, the Grover Norquist of the world, and they can easily endorse a relatively progressive version of the Bush proposal.
Right. But why is it
Although
so
not
important?
that any of them have done so yet.
Right. So you want to provide health care to uninsured poor people. A tax credit is sort of the stupidest way of doing that. Why is it so important to call it a tax thing, tax cut, tax credit, instead of just providing the program that provides the services like S-chip?
Well,
I mean, you're fighting over a crazy distinction.
Sure, whether it's the stupidest way to do it or not, usually when people say that's because a lot of the benefit would go to people who already have insurance. I take it that's probably what you mean?
Well, no, it's a little bit of that. I'm fine with benefit going to people who already have insurance. I'm a little bit of a. I think the tax code is an inefficient way of delivering benefits, especially at the low end. And we have this enormously complex low end of the tax code now, with these 4 intersecting credits: the child tax credit, the additional tax credit, and so forth. Poor people are being driven to tax prep services that cost them a lot of money, that they then get talked into these refund anticipation loans. It's if you do your taxes, if you ever even if you do it on TurboTax, you can see this. But if you ever if you do it by hand, you'll really see it. It used to be like you looked at the things you didn't qualify for that were really the forms that look really complicated, and you say, oh, I'm glad I don't qualify for that. I'm glad I don't have that situation because that looks really complicated. Now, it used to be those things were like above your income level. Now, all those things are below. Like you do the form for the thing where you actually phased out of because you make too much money. They're incredibly complicated. It's a ridiculous way to deliver benefits, and we know that most people don't get it. We spend huge amounts of money trying to help people get the earned income tax credit. Because if they weren't doing that, they actually wouldn't have to fill out a tax form at all. We're delivering so much through this complicated system. There's no earthly reason why you would want to deliver this benefit through the tax code, which gives you no ability to actually make sure that you're doing anything to reduce costs in the healthcare system. Nothing. It gives you nothing at all except just cash. That's actually hard to get to people. Why not structure a program like S-chip? Why not?
Well, I think the argument for the tax credit proposal is that it makes competition easier, makes cost reduction easier. At least that's what that's what I've always heard from sort of the conservative healthcare policy side.
Right. So. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's it. I think that's wrong, but we're at 59 minutes, so we won't launch into a
Next
full
time.
healthcare. We'll do full healthcare wonkery some other time that we do this.
Been nice talking to you.
Nice talking to you, Ramesh.
All right, take care.